Hello, my name is David McElnay. I'm an architect and member at the American Institute of Architects here in Oregon. You've arrived at, and we are very happy to see 60 respondents today for our urban design panel presentation. I'm going to do just a quick introduction, as I'm on the executive committee for the urban design panel, and the urban design panel was formed quite a number of years ago as a collaborative.
But you have a lot of folks throughout Portland who are in older houses. And
Get on that mute, please. As a collaborative between professional disciplines. So the urban design panel has on its executive committee folks from the AIA, folks from the APA, the American Planners Association, and the ASLA, American Society of Landscape Architects. And we welcome any and all interested professionals to these presentations, which happen monthly. We are very grateful to the Oregon and Portland AIA, American Institute of Architects, Center for Architecture, in hosting these presentations. We've gone to Zoom format, obviously, since the pandemic. And right now we have Kurt Wilson, who's the executive director of the Portland AIA.
I'm Garland Woodsong with Cascadia Partners, and David invited me to talk with you today about cluster housing. We wrapped up a cluster housing study for the city of Milwaukie last year, and so that's I'm drawing on that experience for this conversation, but also it goes a little bit beyond what we discussed then. But before I get into that, was there any other housekeeping that we needed to address before we move on?
I think once David gets back on, he can address that during it. Once he gets back on, you just may want to give him about a couple, 30 seconds, and then we can kind of go there. I think the key issue is know that we're recording this and that everyone is on mute. And through the chat box, if you have some questions that you want to ask the speaker, David will be fielding those questions at the end of the presentation. And that's about all. I still think he's still trying to log back on.
Okay. Please type your questions into the chat box, or hold them for type into the chat box, and then we'll hold them until after the presentation, and then look forward to a discussion at that point in time. So I'm going to start presenting. And can everyone see my screen? Okay, seeing the thumbs up here. And I'm just going to make sure I can still see all of you. Yes, I can still see all of you. So as I mentioned, I'm Garland Woodsong with Cascadia Partners. We're a planning firm that we still have a lease on some office space downtown. I still think there's a few people down there on Park Avenue today, but most of us are working remotely, like most of the rest of you. And so, first off, just some context. These are not normal times. We've had protests in the streets for over 100 days, although I'm not sure anyone's out there protesting the smoke right now. This is that iconic picture from the protest in Minneapolis. We have a history of racism as implemented through our zoning codes in this country. I think that's something that as a profession we need to lean into addressing. And so I'm contextualizing this discussion of cluster housing within that context, because it's important to center ourselves in the fact that there were a lot of parts of the systems that have been perpetuated over the decades that were unequal and racially unequal, especially in their effects. The color law, I think, has all the receipts on this, and if you haven't read it, in particular, chapter 4 is distressingly enlightening with regards to the history of racism and zoning. And I just got a text from David saying his internet just blew up, so he may or may not be joining us right now. So within this context, that zoning has been used to racially segregate neighborhoods, and in particular to keep Black people out of white single-family neighborhoods. We can still see the effects of this today. And so, I think the question is, what's part of the solution to that legacy? And part of that solution is allowing for a diversity of housing types in the neighborhoods that we've grown to know as single-family neighborhoods. And so single-family zoning is expensive by design. That leads to economic exclusion. So a solution is middle housing types that deliver deeper levels of housing affordability by default. Cluster housing is just one type, one part of that broader spectrum of middle housing. And of course, in Oregon through HB 2001 and Portland's residential infill project, we're beginning to take those steps to legalize middle housing, and yet you still can't pull a building permit to construct this stuff in those zones, not just yet. So we're still on the arc of progress, right? We're not at the end. So Milwaukie, we were hired in 2017, 2018. Because Milwaukie recognized that there's a problem, that the housing market was going crazy. Housing prices almost doubled coming out of the recession, and part of this is light rails coming to town and bringing new accessibility, new transit accessibility to the city, and part of it is just limited housing options and increased demand without an increase in supply. But in particular, there's affordability crisis that about a quarter of Milwaukie households spent over half of their income on rent. So it's a large imbalance. And supply and demand were not in sync. So according to a market study that we commissioned, Milwaukie needed about 55 to 60 new homes or new units per year to keep up with demand, but they only delivered 40 over the 7-year period from 2010 to 2017. So there's a huge mismatch between the level of supply being brought to market and the demand for that supply. So our study, which we began in 2018 and wrapped up in 2019, was a 3-phase project. I'm skipping straight to the end and giving you the punchline. But first, cluster housing or cottage court is one type of cluster housing. Includes smaller, more affordable units. Its density in a house form. It fits the neighborhood context. Features a central common area. Those are the attributes, the core attributes of this type. So some examples of this type include a bungalow court. This is Sabin Green off of Northeast Prescott Street, built by Eli Spivak. And the price point at this particular one is $135,000 to $450,000 per home. So there's some a pretty good range of housing affordability, diversity just within the 4 homes in this little bungalow court, and that's a reflection of the range of sizes from 575 to 2,600 square feet, and the density is 16 to 24 dwelling units per acre for that bungalow court type. Which is made up of detached single-family homes with small setbacks on common lots. Another example of this style of cluster housing is a townhome court. This example is out on Cooper Street near 82nd. This was built by Rose CDC as an affordable housing project. And so the price for each townhome is in the range of $100,000 to $150,000 per home. They're 800 to 900 square feet plus a porch, and the density is 19 to 35 dwelling units per acre. And these are an attached form of single-family home. So price is driven by size. And it's not a flat relationship. There's an S-curve on that relationship, but larger houses command more price, all other things being equal in the market, than smaller homes. And so we did some studies, our market study of the city of Milwaukie, produce these two outliers that show us the range of costs. And I understand that this data is now a little bit old and prices have increased even beyond this in Milwaukee. But this was an important input to our work, is grounding in this understanding that price and therefore affordability is driven by the size of the homes that are allowed and how many of them that are allowed in each development. So Milwaukee had a cottage cluster code on the books when we were hired. It had been developed maybe 15 years ago, and it only allowed 12 units maximum on each cottage cluster, on each lot, regardless of any other factors. And cottage clusters were only allowed in a certain subset of the zones, and significantly, single-family zones were not in that set. So only 13.5% of the city allowed cottage clusters, and of that, only 16.5% of those lots were large enough to allow all 12 units. And so that turns into only 142 parcels citywide, where you could actually build the full 12 units allowed under the cottage cluster code. So that's, city staff received exactly 0 applications for development under their old cottage cluster code, and we're starting to realize why. Very few properties were eligible. And so larger sites were limited by this maximum number of units allowable of 12. Regardless of site size, you could only get to 12. And so that left on larger parcels a large portion of the lot unbuildable, because again, you can only get to 12 and they can only take up so much space. So that's one thing. Another thing is that there is also a density restriction in the old code. And the density restriction was passed through from the base zoning. And so on smaller sites, the density restricted the number of units you could build, and on larger sites, the number 12 restricted it. So it became very difficult to imagine a scenario in which any cottage cluster would pencil on any site. And then take into a fact that the cottage cluster code, in combination with the base zoning, the elements of the base zoning flowed through, resulted in 11 different setbacks that had to be respected on each cottage cluster lot. And by the time you took into account all 11 of those setbacks on a 6,000 square foot site, the only part of the cottage that would remain legal to build would be the front porch. And that's only because the front porch was allowable within a setback. So this is kind of a cartoony illustration of one of the problems with that code. And I'm going to pause here for a sec to say, welcome back, David.
Oh, thank you.
And David, were there any other housekeeping items that you needed to mention before we continue?
You know, Garland, I can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I came back in through my phone. There's a local neighborhood internet went down, kicked me out. I was just going to point out that we were hosted by the AIA, that the announcements for the urban design panel are shown on Thursdays at 3, which is from the AIA every Thursday at 3 on their website, their events calendar. And there's a Friday virtual happy hour at 4 p.m. on Fridays with the AIA, hosted by the AIA. You can find it on their website. It's always very interesting with multiple topics. If folks are interested, we are recording this, and the AIA will make that available. You can find it in the chat section when we get done, and we're going to field questions via the chat, and then do that when you get done, Garland. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, David. So another issue that we had identified with the existing code was the parking requirements, and on smaller sites, all of the requirements, not just for the number of parking spaces, but for the maneuvering space behind each parking space, resulted in 2 out of potential 6 cottages being eliminated from being feasible on this 9,200 square foot site that we studied for this example. So we proposed a new code, and to crash test the code, we had 4 property owners participate in the study to do site studies. So these are the locations of those 4 studies. The first one on Southeast Harvey Street was a deep and skinny lot. All of the lots were zoned R7. This is 24,000 square feet. We worked with Opticos Design out of Berkeley to perform some site studies. And so this is a concept that they came up with. For each site, we produced 2 flavors of concept, a max build scenario to test like what's the most intensity that could fit on each one of these lots and what lessons might we learn from that. And then the next one was the ready to build scenario, which is a more context sensitive version. And so for this one, the interesting concept that Opticos proposed was to use a woonerf for the front half of the common green that would allow for a space that could be used by automobiles to access the parking in the middle of the site, but when the residents weren't driving their cars in or out, could also flex and become a play area, or could be used in other ways by residents as an outdoor plaza and shared common space. And that'd be accompanied by an actual common green in the back half of the lot. So that's a flexible concept that we carried through to our recommendation to allow, as it opens up these skinnier sites that otherwise would have a lot of difficulty accommodating on-site parking to serve the cottages. And then the context-sensitive design dials back the number of homes from 16 to 13. One thing is that when this concept was initially developed, we were proposing 1/2 parking space per home, but as the project progressed through public comment, that was increased to 1 parking space per home. This concept would still work, but some of the homes would need to become carriage houses with like an ADU-sized home above parking below, in order to accommodate all of the parking on site, which is what was shown in this this max build scenario, the carriage homes in the center. But another thing to look at is these affordability levels. 59% of AMI, 42% of AMI, 69% of AMI. So these are delivering using private market economics levels of affordability that are below 80%. And for those of you who are familiar with this, Portland's inclusionary housing says that affordable housing is either at 60% or 80% of AMI, right? You have to meet those 2 levels. Of course, AMI in Multnomah County is higher than AMI in Clackamas County, so it's not exactly apples to apples. But this is one of the interesting findings, is that these cluster housing products are delivering more affordable products simply by allowing more smaller homes on each site. So our next study site on Southeast 36th in Milwaukie is more of a square-ish site, kind of a classic cluster housing site. So the first concept included 11 total homes, including a couple of carriage homes, and those tiny carriage homes, 400 square feet each, would be affordable to 29% of the area median income, which is kind of an amazing level of affordability to achieve from the private sector. And then the ready to build scenario dials back the level of affordability and the number of homes on the site, but is still pretty impressive in what it's achieving. And one note is you'll see that we're calling out the existing trees to preserve on each site. City of Milwaukie has a goal of achieving a 40% citywide tree canopy, and their planning director asked that we model that on each site. They weren't quite sure how to implement it, but they wanted to know, could each site support its own 40% coverage of tree canopy? And so we looked at it, and part of that is preserving the existing trees, and part of that is making sure that there's room to plant more trees to get up to that 40%. Here's another site. It's a rather large site, and an adjacent property owner reached out and wanted to be included in that. So it's actually 2 sites that we planned for as one, in order to allow for fire access to the site, because it's a larger site. So the first concept included a mix of cottages, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes on the site. Got to 36 total homes. And then the second concept didn't include the duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, dialed back to single cottages, but still managed to get 34 of them onto the site. And so that was instructive as well. And you can see that the fire access lane is provided on this site concept to make sure that the Clackamas County Fire Department regulations are complied with. Another study site, one that we used to test some more attached concepts down by the Safeway in Milwaukie. So this concept is for townhomes, where each townhome includes an ADU. And so that allowed us to fit 36 total homes onto the site and get down to 33% of AMI for the ADU homes, which is pretty impressive levels of affordability. But then the ready to build scenario, the more context sensitive scenario, worked with the landowner to preserve the heritage tree on the site and some of the other trees on the site. So it got down to only 10 total homes on the site, but still getting to 57% of AMI on the affordability levels. So pretty impressive. So through those site studies and our code audit, we learned that there aren't any one single silver bullets for affordability, that there's multiple changes that need to be made to allow for workforce housing prices in the market. So we recommended allowing a detached version of cluster housing in all the residential zones in the city, and also allowing for the attached flavor of cluster housing. So that'd be like a townhome court or apartment court in areas within walking distance of frequent transit and in the commercial zones. We also recommended regulating building form rather than density, and reducing the setback and open space requirements, and reducing the parking and on-site circulation requirements, and adding bicycle parking requirements, because it all kind of, in our minds, in our discussions with the community and city staff, it kind of fits together of people still need mobility. And so if you're going to dial back parking requirements, you still have to think through how is mobility going to be provided, and bicycles are an obvious solution for a smaller city, relatively flat like Milwaukie. And we also recommended reducing or waiving certain fees such as SDCs and frontage improvement fees, although that wound up being a rather minor portion because Milwaukee's fee structures are not as intense as, say, Portland's. So the map that we recommended is to allow for cluster housing in all the low density neighborhoods, the R7 predominantly in the city, as well as to allow attached housing in transit connected locations and in commercial multifamily zones. So you'll see in the pink the potential transit connected locations. Another thing that we recommended is that transit connectivity be via sidewalks. And so Milwaukie doesn't have a lot of sidewalks today. And so a sidewalk network would need to be demonstrated by the applicant to prove that you could walk safely from a cluster housing development to the nearest frequent transit stop. So those pink zones are areas where if the sidewalks are present, or the sidewalk network can be demonstrated, you'd be able to walk to frequent transit on those sidewalks, and therefore you could build the attached flavor of cluster housing. But this is not saying that the sidewalks do exist. It's just saying if they existed, then those are the areas that would be within the distance and would be eligible for that. So a little caveat on that. So back to this conversation of zoning and affordability. Another way that we at Cascadia Partners measure affordability is via something we call the AMI thermometer, where we use this metaphor, visual metaphor of a thermometer to demonstrate the level of affordability that that you can attain. And on the left, it's the level of AMI. On the right, it's the occupations that the average wage corresponds to that level of AMI. So you can see a research assistant or server, an auto mechanic, journeyman plumber, a nurse, assistant professor, physician. You know, these occupations correspond to those levels of income on average. So what does that look like? This example is actually calibrated for Southwest Portland, but you can see that a single family home, new construction in Southwest Portland, would only be affordable to a physician, not really affordable to anyone else. But what if you instead could build a fourplex? All of a sudden, it's affordable not just to the physician, but also to the registered nurse who's, you know, potentially working in the same office. And if that became a sixplex, then you know, maybe an experienced journeyman plumber might be able to afford it. If it's an eightplex, then definitely it's affordable to the plumber. And if it's an eightplex with smaller apartments, again, the relationship of size to pricing, then you're getting down to the level where the auto mechanic, the server, the bartender, even the research assistant might have a shot at being able to live in that neighborhood. So when all those types are banned, that's how economic exclusion works, right? You're only serving the rich white people. That's the mechanism there. And so back to Milwaukie, when we were doing the code audit, one of the things we measured was what's the level of affordability that can be attained with a standard single family home. Okay, that's 181% of AMI, right? That's very expensive. Their old cottage cluster standard, if you had 4 homes rather than 1, which is the minimum size of the cottage cluster, you're already getting down to 107% of AMI, theoretically, assuming you build that. If you remove the density limit, you allow 1 more cottage, it gets cheaper. If you remove the setbacks and separation standards, you get another 2 cottages. If you reduce the private and shared yard standards, you get another one. If you allow on-street parking to count towards the off-street parking requirements, you get another one. If you allow a full 2 stories, their old code only allowed 1.5-story cottages, you get another one. And if you allow attached units on that site, townhomes instead of cottages, then you can get up to 15 cottages. And you're going down to 68% AMI from the 181% AMI we started off with. So we found that this is a very clear way to demonstrate that linkage between the zoning regulations and the level of affordability that you might expect as an outcome in the private market. And the extent of single family zoning in Milwaukie is not small. So we looked at this as a part of the study, and 86.5% of the residentially zoned area of Milwaukie is in single family zones. So if Black people are generally locked out of home ownership for a variety of reasons, then Black people are, because of economic exclusion, effectively locked out of 86.5% of the city of Milwaukee's residential area. Wow, you know, like that's shocking. And so that's a nice theory, right? But does the evidence show that? So we looked at the census for ACS 2013-2017 from the Census Planning Database 2019, and found that yes, there is a correlation between the areas where there are multifamily buildings in the city and the areas where there are Black people in Milwaukie. So if there are Black people living in the city of Milwaukie, there's not a whole lot of them. Notice that the scale maxes out at 9.8% of the census tract. But that's where the concentrations are those tracts where there are multifamily. So we're seeing that this is not just theoretical economic segregation. This is real, actual economic segregation in the city of Milwaukie, and it's being driven by the zoning code and has been since the 1940s, 1950s. So some other design and details of the cluster housing code for Milwaukie. The development standards that we proposed were intended to promote market rate provision of homes affordable to households of a variety of incomes and sizes. and therefore races, right? Since there is that link to race from economic exclusion. Another intent was to encourage a design that balances a reduction in private outdoor space with shared outdoor common area, right? That's the trade-off of going to live in a housing cluster, is you don't get so much private yard, but you get more shared yard, more space for community space. Another intent was to promote community building, both within the housing cluster and with the surrounding neighborhood. And part of how that's accomplished is to require a porch or a recessed entry on all of the homes in the cluster, but especially for those facing the street, to require that to face the street to allow for engagement between the community and street life. And also, there's some definitions of what the cluster means, how much of the cluster needs to be enclosed for it to qualify as a cluster rather than just a bunch of homes on a lot. And so we introduced the concept of the golden ratio also to regulate the relationship between the height of the homes and the width of the common green to make sure that the common green is not overwhelmed by the height of the adjacent structures. And some regulations to deal with different situations that crop up in that scenario. And so here's a table listing all of the regulations. There's a lot here. I'm not going to go through all of it. But one thing I will call out is that we were asked by City Council, okay, well, look, you're saying that the private market could deliver market rate affordability, and that's neat, but how are you going to require that the private market deliver affordability? Like we have a housing crisis, we have a housing affordability crisis. How are you going to promise to us that this will help to solve that? Not just hypothetically, but actually. And we said, well, we'll add one more regulation, and that's to regulate the maximum average floor area per home at 1,000 square feet. What does that do? Well, this is a concept that comes from Santa Monica, California, of all places. And what it does is it says you can have housing diversity within the housing cluster. You can have big homes and you can have little homes, but on average, your average home size cannot exceed 1,000 square feet. And that ensures that you have enough homes under 1,000 square feet that you'll have affordability. Because again, the relationship is from size to price. So smaller homes are cheaper. And so if we ensure that there's sufficient smaller homes in the housing cluster to bring the average size down below 1,000, then our pro forma modeling tells us that'll ensure that there's going to be housing affordable to households making less than 100% and most likely less than 80% of area median income in that housing cluster. And so we felt that that was the softest touch, the light touch way to get to market-based affordability without going the route of full-fledged inclusionary housing, which seemed a little bit inappropriate for cluster housing, where you can build a cluster with as few as 3 or 4 homes, right? So that's the bulk of the regulations, and we can come back to these during question period if folks have any questions on any of these. But I will jump through to one more slide, which is we said that cluster housing would also be allowed in mixed use areas, which brings up the possibility of a mixed use housing cluster. And so as just a little sketch exercise, I threw together a sketch of what might that look like. What does a housing cluster look like if you have mixed of uses? And so it's just one concept, and I'm sure that all of you could put together a more compelling image than me, because I'm not a designer, but I will toss that at you for discussion. And with that, that is my presentation, and I look forward to taking questions on it.
Well, thank you very much, Garland. That was great. I was able to jump in with my phone, but I wasn't able to track chat. So my colleague on the X committee is Bob Boileau, is going to help throw some questions out here from the chat session.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Got your back, David.
Thank
Before we ask questions, I think there's Michael Fifield had a great statement. He said, I'm just read it off. For your information, the 2007 City of Portland Courtyard Housing Competition resulted in documentation of designs and, more importantly, design principles for courtyard housing on 2 prototype sites, 100 by 100 with joint use parking open space, and a larger site with separate parking and open space. You can find this on the City of Portland website. So thank you, Michael, for informing us about that. But we have a few questions, and these are, I'm glad people asked these because I was going to ask it. The first one was, do you pull development back from the access road a certain distance to give cars a chance to react to the winter? And you may want to bring that image back, one of the first ones with the winter. And by the way, those are great images where you do the sketch and then you do the sketch up above that. And then a follow-up to that question too is, well, let's just, if you could address that one, then I'll follow up with another question related to that. Yeah, I think that was the one. So I'll read it again. Do you pull development back from the access road a certain distance to give cars a chance to react to the winter?
Do you mean where the winter meets the street? There'd still be a setback from the street as shown on the image.
Yeah, Patrick asked that question, and I think so. I think it looks like it's pulled back there, but just so when you, just so when they're pulling in there, obviously they see that there's people, it's a shared access street. So maybe that's one of the questions. You know, there is a setback, so.
Yeah, and you know, it's Woodruff inspired. It's not going to be a public street. I think a lot of times Woodruff is a design treatment for a public street, maybe even a through street. This is not a through street. It's more of a shared driveway. And one of the things that we proposed was to use paving treatments such as cobbles to really indicate that this was a very, very low speed shared space. Or another concept is that it's a lawn with 2 concrete tracks down it corresponding to the wheel tracks. So when you're looking at it, it kind of looks like maybe 2 parallel pedestrian pathways, but you can actually drive a car across it to get in and out. But that makes it clear that it's more of a common green. And so those are 2 of the concepts that we explored with Opticos to really make clear that this is a very low speed space, so that the interface between this shared driveway and the street would be just like any other driveway interface with the street. Very low speed, you're inching out before you proceed into traffic.
How did you solve the issue with the fire department as far as dead end? Usually there's a limitation of about 150 feet or so.
Yeah, that drives the garage placement. So the last garage back there does not exceed 150 feet from the street.
Okay. Next question is, what do you find are the best ways to coordinate clustered housing design with civil engineering requirements, including utilities and roadways?
I mean, you know, you need a civil engineer on your team, right? When you're as an applicant proposing these, but we didn't find that there was any outstanding civil design questions that were really specific to this, that were like a yellow flag.
Okay.
Along those lines, Bob, does Milwaukie have a transportation planning department or transportation planner, transportation engineer, that kind of thing that you were able to interface with Garland, or not? Yeah,
we actually worked up one of these plans and ran it through their like chief permit review officer to flag any issues with it. And I will say that the main civil issue is related to street frontage. And our recommendation there is that if you want to count the on-street parking space towards the site parking requirements, then you have to bring the street frontage up to code, including that parking space. That parking space needs to meet the city's code, whatever the city engineer says it needs look like, whether that's full pavement or if the city engineer allows gravel there with the curb, whatever that is. Those parking spaces need to be brought up to standards. But normally you have to either improve the frontage or accept a waiver and pay a fee. And so that's the recommendation, is if you're going to count those parking spaces, then you don't get to pay the fee and accept the waiver. You actually do have to improve them up to standards for them to count. That's the main civil issue that we grappled with.
Okay, here's another question. What about market feasibility? Did you look at costs of site acquisition, construction costs, permit fees, SDCs? What would be feasible, financially feasible with and without subsidy for each of the study sites?
Yeah, so we looked at all those factors for each of these sites, and we solved for feasibility. So when you see the affordability number, that's a number that flows from a feasible pro forma. So none of the pro formas we put forward were not feasible. They all met a 12% IRR, which is generally the sniff test for private development. So they are market rate feasible. The construction costs, I will say, for licensed architects who are used to working on bigger projects in the area, you might laugh at the construction cost assumptions per square foot, because I think we're using 165 per square foot, and almost no one is seeing costs for most development less than 200 square foot in Portland these days, right? And yet, when you look at the production builders who are bringing new single-family homes to market in Milwaukie, and you back into their numbers, they're having to achieve hard costs at something like 125 per square foot. And so we felt, well, those are probably more the guys who are going to be building these, and less, it's going to be less the guys who do, the big projects with the cranes. And so we felt that, yeah, that 165 figure, you can debate it, and let's have that debate. But maybe it's a good compromise between the 200-foot multifamily and the 125-foot single family, because this is middle housing, right? So that number is somewhere in the middle. But I'm certainly open to having that debate. And I will say, like, if there is a weakness in the pro forma modeling, it's that we didn't assume higher hard costs.
Okay, next question, Jim Hinke. Did Public Works review comment on the winner for a driveway idea?
They did, yeah. They thought it was an interesting concept. And yes, this is that 150-foot limit. Definitely was reviewed with them, and they confirmed that is the number that is relevant in Clackamas County, and confirmed also with the Clackamas County Fire Marshal.
Oh, good. It's always hard to bring in a new idea to a lot of the engineers. Another question for Michael Fifield. Another design consideration is the site layout to allow for simple ownership and not a condo with the HOA fees. The winning scheme in the Portland Courtyard housing competition was a good example of simple design with 6 units with a shared driveway. Are these the one that we're looking for, fee simple?
Well, that's an interesting question. And we grappled with this because we know that fee simple is the goal for most developers working at this scale. That, in fact, most developers, full stop, don't want to do condos in Oregon. We get that. And yet, if you're talking about for sale, you got 3 options. It's either fee simple, condo, or cooperative. And of those, like, almost no one's doing cooperatives in Oregon yet, maybe. So the question with fee simple, though, is how do you do it, right? Because you have shared courts here. And our proposal was, well, look to the suburbs. When you get a new suburban subdivision, you get fee simple homes on lots, but then there's a shared pool, and there's a shared walking path. And how do they handle that? Well, you do it with the HOA. So you still have an HOA that holds and manages the common areas, and each home in that subdivision is a member of the HOA. And so it'd be the same thing with this. with or without condominium, you still have to have an HOA to govern and manage the common area, in particular to deal with common area expenses, liability, and maintenance. And so then the question is, well, how do you get there? How do you get to these tiny homes on tiny lots? And our answer was eliminate the minimum parcel size in cluster housing developments. So that way, it doesn't matter how small you make that cottage, you can draw a parcel and it can fit on its own parcel. And you don't have to, oh crap, there's a minimum lot size. No, there's no minimum lot size. And that's the pathway that we recommend to get there. So I think that there's some obstacles for planners to grapple with and coming to accept that recommendation of allowing no minimum lot size in the cluster housing development, but to us it was the clear solution and the right answer.
So just the image we're looking at now, that could be both a, as you said, a fee simple if you didn't have a minimum lot size requirement, or condo.
Yeah, or
okay.
Cooperative.
Or cooperative. Question from Kevin. Is it assumed that stormwater will be handled primarily as underground detention?
That's our assumption, yes. And that doesn't work everywhere, but our understanding is that it does work in most of Milwaukie. But for instance, in West Portland, we've been advised by BES that it doesn't work because you can't perk and the soils are too steep. So, if this is a prototype for cluster housing code beyond Milwaukie, including in areas with soils that don't perk or where there's stability and landslide issues, then of course on those sites, you need to deal with stormwater differently. But for all these design studies, we assumed that stormwater could be dealt with underground detention.
Question from Patrick. Do you have any references or any additional thoughts on cooperatives?
Yes. I recommend that we have a whole session on cooperatives at some point in the future because it's a deep, deep topic. We don't do enough of them in Oregon. I think that there's a huge potential for cooperatives, but if you talk about the potential for cooperatives, you can't really get deep into that topic without talking about financing and who would finance a cooperative, who would finance someone to purchase a share of a corporation that corresponds to a home and issue a mortgage on that share, right? It's a different way of structuring home ownership. And the answer is no one is currently doing in business that I know of, having talked to folks in the finance industry, has made that their business model, but there's a number of financial firms out of New York City that specialize or offer up cooperative financing, and they're willing to do business in Oregon if asked. So I think that there are potential solutions out there, but it would take an intentional effort to spin up more cooperative housing, to deliver more cooperative housing. And that effort goes beyond design. It goes into finance and legal issues. Although I don't know of any outstanding legal issues that would prevent cooperatives in Oregon. I believe they are legal, they're just not used.
I just wanted to make everyone aware that we have, Kurt Wilson from AIA Oregon has put a lot of references and links on the chat box to a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. So if anyone has a chance to read that. Speaking of Kurt Wilson, you mentioned the public process through the study. Could you identify the stakeholders invited to participate, the resistance you received from stakeholders, and how you responded or how the recommendations deviated from your preferences? Yeah,
that's a great question, and one I'd excluded from my presentation, but I'll certainly talk to it. So we had an advisory committee on the project from the start to the finish of the project that was made up of specialists in cluster housing, specialists in Milwaukie policy, and representatives of the neighborhoods where our study sites were located. And so we brought them along from start to finish of the project, and also embolden them to be project ambassadors back to the neighborhood associations, and got some valuable feedback. But in general, the feedback that we received from that group was, you're on the right track. This is the direction we want to go. We do want to solve for greater affordability in our neighborhoods. We like that these concepts fit the scale of the surrounding neighborhoods, that these are house scaled projects, that they're not out of scale to the neighborhood. We like that you're planning for trees and showing how trees can be integrated into the design. Then when we took this to the project open house and opened it up to general public comment, invited members of the general public to come in, that's when we heard that our proposed parking ratio of 1/2 space per unit was maybe too low. We didn't hear that from everyone. We heard that from the older folks. The younger folks in the room didn't care about parking, but folks over 50 definitely cared about parking. We're very concerned that we plan for everyone to have 1 parking space per home. And so hearing that constituency loud and clear, that's the parking ratio that we recommended, was 1 parking space per home, but with an allowance for on-street parking for all of the zones that were outside of the frequent transit walking distance. And then our concession to the younger folks was to provide a pathway to get to lower parking ratios if you can demonstrate that you're within walking distance of frequent transit and or already in a mixed use or a commercial zone. But that's while we were under contract, that was the flavor of the positive and negative public comments that we received. I understand that there has been subsequent public comment that's come in to city council, but I'm not actually as up on the nature of those comments or what their concerns were.
Question from Susan. A session on cooperative housing would be great. Also, there are some good examples in conjunction with land trusts in the San Francisco Bay Area. So more of a statement there. Any comment on that? Are you aware of any San Francisco Bay Area?
I'm not as familiar with San Francisco Bay Area cooperatives. I think I'm familiar with I think there's a couple of apartment buildings in the city of San Francisco where the tenants formed a cooperative to purchase the building from the owner so that they could have a self-managed building. And that's cool, but that's not new construction. And so, you know, and it's a good example, but what I'm not aware of is any examples of new construction cooperatives, which is the topic I'm most interested in personally.
Okay, question from Jim. Okay, whoop, just jumped away. There are a lot of questions coming in now. Did an arborist, landscape architect, horticulturalist expert help advise about tree preservation, canopy, landscape issues? Any key points for their studies?
We had the architects at Opticos advise on it, but we did not have a landscape architect on our team. We understand the city has retained an arborist to help advise them on turning these recommendations into the zoning code, and that process is currently underway with Herbsworks in the lead of that team. But I will say that it's a little bit beyond the scope of our project, was to get into the details of the arborist concerns. We stopped at the design study showing that it seems feasible to preserve trees. We asked the architects to design around the large existing trees on their context-sensitive studies, and we showed that it seems technically feasible to hit that 40% tree canopy coverage. But that's kind of a conceptual design level, which is where we stopped. And arborists and landscape architects would kind of come in at a more detailed design level.
Great, you stayed within your budget, I guess. You stayed on scope. Kurt just wanted to remind everyone that we're going to have, this was presentation is being recorded and it should be available in the next day or two, and there's a link to it from Kurt. Also, what are some of the ideas for private outdoor spaces, including rooftops? Any discussion there?
We didn't really get into rooftop space, pro or con. There's nothing that would prevent it if someone wanted to propose it, but we didn't put any handles in the code that would allow it to count towards the outdoor space, because the only regulation over outdoor space is the common area. And so any other private outdoor space that we provided would be optional, but not required. And we felt that that was, again, because the previous code seemed to overregulate cottage cluster out of feasibility, we erred on the side of lighter regulation for our proposed code. And so no private outdoor space is required under this code. It's not that it's prohibited. You could certainly provide it, and you could provide it as a rooftop deck, or you provide it as a shared yard, but it's certainly not required. So that's where we erred. Is it would be up to the design professional to propose that and get it permitted. No reason you couldn't. One thing that's related though is that the old code, and this is design, the old code seemed to be written with the intent of producing craftsman cottages, right? There's a lot of design details that were from the craftsman playbook. And we thought, you know, that's cool. We like craftsman cottages too. Like, they're pretty, right? You know, our cities are full of them. And yet, Milwaukee's not a craftsman town. Milwaukee's full of ranch homes. So why would you require craftsman cottages in a city that's full of ranch homes? So we got rid of any kind of restrictions on the flavor of design. So you could do modern cubes, you could do craftsman cottages, you could do whatever you wanted to propose in terms of design. There's a few simple design elements that are regulated, like porches and windows, but those are elements that could fit within any style of design. So I just wanted to mention that, is that this is a design style agnostic code proposal.
Question about what type of unit energy assumptions were part of the design?
Assuming that you would meet modern building energy codes, but we didn't have any specific energy assumptions beyond that.
Okay, well, David, I don't see any more questions, and since it's right at the 1:01, we may send everyone home early.
Yeah,
they're already home anyway.
I finally got back on the internet too, so I was just furiously typing a question, but you're right, it's 1 o'clock, so it's time for everyone to wrap up. But I'll probably chase you down offline, Garland, about the thoughts that you came up with in terms of how these developments connect to the community, right? Because right there, that image right there shows a kind of a sideways dead end kind of thing relative to good public outdoor space and community connectivity. So I heard you mention some points about master planning, pedestrian access, and things like that. Hopefully you had a chance to think through those kinds of items.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so anyway, sorry for my sort of flubbing the intro there. Garland, you did a great job. Kurt Wilson jumped off. He had to do something else, and that was a bunch of good questions. This is obviously a really hot topic. We really appreciate you coming out and getting involved, making the presentation today, Garland. I imagine you'd be open for folks to shoot you an email if they have follow-on questions.
Yes, and let me jump on the chat.
Throw that in the chat.
Yeah, I'll put my email address in the chat here if I can find it. I'm going to stop.
And as Bob encouraged, check out the Vimeo, the other links that Kurt put in. The AIA is really upping the ante as a partner in this multidisciplinary panel. We have some other great sessions coming up for the rest of the year. We're going to try to keep our schedule of doing monthly, you know, whether the forests are on fire or the pandemic is raging. We've been trying very hard on the executive committee to bring interesting presenters, and we'll continue to do so. I think with that, Bob, unless there's anything else, I'm going to say thanks everyone for being here. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, drop your email, Garland. There it is. Garland's got his email in the chat. And Michael Fifield, good to see you. And take care.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Garland, good job.
Bye for now.